All right, let's dive into one of history's most fascinating and, honestly, baffling contradictions, the story of the Russian Empire under the Romanovs. This is a tale of a nation reaching for the future with one hand, while desperately clinging to the past with the other.
And that really is the question, isn't it? This is what we're going to unpack. For more than 200 years, Russia projected this image of incredible power, high culture, and constant progress. But that shiny, glittering surface, it was all built on a foundation of pure brutality. So, how did this paradox even happen? Let's get into it. So, where do we start? Well, our story kicks off with a giant of a man with an even bigger ambition, Peter the Great. He took one look at his country and knew if it was going to survive, it needed to become a lot more like the West. Now, you have to remember, it's kind of hard to imagine today, but back in the 17th century, Russia was seen as this remote, backward place. It barely had any ice-free ports for trade, it was way behind in technology, and get this, it literally operated on a different timeline. Its calendar was dated from the creation of the world, not the birth of Christ. Totally separate. But Peter didn't just admire the West from afar. No, he went there himself. In 1697, the Tsar, the King of Russia, traveled in disguise as a regular carpenter just to learn modern techniques firsthand. And when he got back, he unleashed an absolute storm of reforms, dragging Russia, kicking and screaming, into the modern age. And I mean, Peter was absolutely relentless. Nothing, and I mean nothing, was sacred in his drive to modernize. And this right here is a perfect example. He literally took the voice of the church, its bells, and forged them into the new voice of the state, cannons for his modern, Western-style army. And that gets to the dark side of all this progress. His magnificent new capital, St. Petersburg, was supposed to be a symbol of the new Russia. But it was built on a swamp by serfs, basically slaves, under the most horrific conditions. Thousands and thousands died. So yeah, it was a window to Europe, for sure, but it was a window paid for with human lives.
Okay, let's fast forward a bit to the next big chapter. Decades later, another incredibly powerful ruler takes the throne. This time, it's one who would add this layer, this veneer of philosophy and high culture to Peter's raw power, Catherine the Great.
Catherine was a total master of public relations. She presented herself to the world as this enlightened monarch. She was writing letters to Europe's greatest thinkers. She was championing education and the arts. And she turned St. Petersburg into a cultural capital that could go toe-to-toe with any city in Europe.
In fact, her reign is where we get this exact term. The legend says that her top advisor, Potemkin, built these fake, happy little villages along a route she was traveling just to hide how poor the region really was. Now, whether that's totally true or not, who knows, but Potemkin village became the perfect metaphor for her entire rule. A beautiful show on the outside, hiding a really grim reality.
Okay, so now it's time to pull back that curtain. Because for all the fancy talk about philosophy and art, the engine of Catherine's Russia, the thing that made it all go, ran on something very old and very brutal: serfdom.
Just look at these numbers. A staggering 3/4, 75% of the entire population of the Russian Empire were serfs. These people were legally tied to the land they worked. They were, for all intents and purposes, owned by the nobility.
And this slide just puts the whole paradox in black and white. On the left, you've got her official instruction, full of Enlightenment ideas about equality. And on the right, a typical newspaper ad from the time, treating human beings, a whole family, like property to be bought and sold. The contradiction is just staggering.
So why? Why would this supposedly enlightened empress not only allow this system to exist, but actually make it stronger? Well, it really comes down to cold, hard politics. The entire economy ran on serf labor. Her own power depended on keeping the nobles happy. And then, when a massive serf rebellion broke out, and later the French Revolution happened, she got terrified of any ideas that might challenge her power. So, she chose stability over her own stated ideals.
Okay, so this brings us to our next major player, Catherine's grandson, Alexander I. And this guy, he seemed like he was perfectly positioned to finally fix Russia's huge contradiction.
See, Alexander was Catherine's pet project. He was educated by a Swiss tutor on the exact principles of liberty and equality that she loved to talk about but never really acted on. So when he came to the throne, hopes were through the roof. Everyone was thinking, this is it. This is the guy who's going to bring Russia into the modern age for everyone.
And his big moment, his defining moment on the world stage comes down to this one year, 1814. After this brutal war that saw Moscow itself burned to the ground, the Russian army had finally, against all odds, defeated Napoleon. And at the head of all the Allied armies, Tsar Alexander I rode triumphantly into Paris. On the world stage, he was the man. He was the hero who had freed Europe from a tyrant. Surely, you'd think, this great liberator would now bring that same freedom back home to his own people.
But he didn't. And this is where the story takes its tragic turn. This is the final act, where that grand illusion just shatters, and the promise of a peaceful transformation is lost for good.
Just like his grandmother Catherine, when it came down to a choice between real radical reform and keeping things stable, Alexander froze. He talked about ending serfdom, he even ordered some studies, but in the end, he did basically nothing. He was terrified of angering the nobles whose power and wealth depended entirely on that system.
So think about this. What about all the soldiers who had followed him to Paris? They had marched all across Europe and they'd seen a totally different world, a world with rights, with constitutions, a world of citizens, not just subjects, and then they came home. And what did they come home to? An absolute ruler and a nation of serfs.
That contradiction was just too much for them to handle. So when Alexander died in 1825, a group of these officers, about 3,000 of them, staged a rebellion. They called serfdom what it was, a national disgrace. But their demands for a constitution and freedom were met with cannon fire. The uprising was brutally, completely crushed.
And just like that, the paradox was set in stone. By the 1820s, this is what you've got. On the surface, Russia is a major world power, with a modern military and a sophisticated European culture. But just beneath that shiny veneer, it was still an absolute monarchy, built on a medieval system of human bondage and deeply hostile to the very ideas of liberty its own leaders sometimes pretended to admire.
And that leaves us with this one kind of chilling question. The Romanovs had built themselves a modern war machine, but they refused to build a modern society to go with it. You've got a nation with the weapons of the 19th century, but the social structure of the 15th. How long could a massive contradiction like that possibly hold?